So my name is Nate Claver. I'm an economic development consultant, do primary work with Cedar Falls CAPS program, and also support a program with Connecting Business and Education with Butler Grundy Development. We've got a number of panelists here from organizations, from business. We heard earlier today from Luke and Brian, and they'll tag in on what we are hearing locally from our business and organizations. And what you'll find out, there is a lot of similarities between our communities and barriers that we're finding to try and get to that point. So I'll start like we did last time down at the end, and everybody introduce yourselves, your role, and what you're seeing as a primary barrier with your organization. I think it's on.
My name is Salem Timbo from Hy-Vee. I'm the Director of Diversity for Hy-Vee in my 21st year. I'm a Libra. There we go, that's a lunch, right? Very excited to be here. My main focus is diversity. I oversee recruiting, also diversity recruiting, and training and education back to our stores, which also includes building relationships in our communities that we do serve. So that's really what I do.
Good afternoon. My name is Mark Little. I'm the General Manager of Metropolitan Transit Authority here in Waterloo. We provide the local city bus service and also the ADA paratransit service. I also serve on a national board as the Iowa delegate for CTAA and a couple other boards. And believe me, I know transportation is a barrier, especially in communities of our size and smaller. So I hope we get to discuss that this afternoon.
My name is Mary Jansen. I'm the Children and Family Services Director at EPI. So that means a couple of things. I lead the Child Care Resource Referral Grant here in Northeast Iowa. We work with child care providers on improving the quality, training. We also work with families on finding child care. We also house the Child and Adult Care Food Program, so CACFP, within our agency, and also will soon be co-leading the new child care center at the ALC with Hawkeye Child Development Center, so we're super excited. And I co-lead the Blackhawk Child Care Coalition, so it's a new coalition that's formed within the last year to look at the child care barriers across the Cedar Valley. And my co-partner is Kay England out in the crowd. She's out there waving her arm. And Kyle also serves on it, who's next to me.
Thank you, Kyle Rode, HR Director for CPM Holdings Incorporated. We are a local manufacturer in Waterloo, which is our world headquarters. And prior to that, I worked with Omega Cabinetry. And a lot of my work has been revolving around finding new and diverse talent pools to draw upon in this 2.1% unemployment environment. And really that's taken the shape of identifying and attempting to remove barriers that are keeping people from entering the workforce.
Luke Kwiaczynski, Executive Director at Urban Alliance.
And Brian Parsons, Senior Director of Programming at Urban Alliance.
Kwiaczynski, am I right?
Kwiaczynski.
I even said it in my head. So, as we talk more about barriers, and obviously, there's the 6 that we talked about, and I might lean on you if I don't hit them all, but when you look at education, you look at substance abuse, you look at criminal background, housing, child care, transportation, substance abuse. And, it's all in there that we deal with, and there's some other obstacles that get in there as well. But let's start with one that I think affects a lot of people, no matter your socioeconomic. It is transportation. When you look at whether you have the means to get to work, or it's even distance to get to work. I guess going from the standpoint of our regional transit system here, what are you hearing from companies, especially the last 3 or 4 years, that are, I'm sure they're calling you saying, get a stop in front of my business?
Oh, that's true. I think as you see the community expand, there's been more and more of a demand on transportation. I take transportation and look at it as we do with roads and bridges. I think it's been neglected for so long, and we're trying to play catch up, especially at the federal level. But yes, it's difficult. Getting to work, getting in a reasonable amount of time has been very difficult. You have to have more frequent service. But we hear it all the time. We hear it all the time from companies, and we hear it from agencies that are trying to get folks to and from work, whether you're not operating early enough or late enough into the evening for the evening job. So It's an issue. We're aware of it. Like I said, I'm the Iowa delegate on national board. We hear this in every community. And I think there has to be a change in how we fund transit and just the needs of what people need. Take a look at the needs in each community and address them accordingly.
It's a good thing Councilman Darris here and Mayor Hart, and we can get that funding going, right?
Yeah, I've already asked the mayor. I said,
Raise my hand then.
my alternate one was going to be we need to increase funding in both cities, but then I seen Councilman Mayor there, so we'll do that later.
He can vote, I can't.
Well, in visiting with Luke and Brian here the last couple days, you can talk about that barrier being transportation. Even if you have transportation, sometimes putting gas in the car is an obstacle too. But you've come starting to develop some incentives that some companies hadn't really thought about, that they're actually seeing some results on employee retention.
Yep. So the story that Nate's referring to is about 4 weeks ago, I sat down on a long session with a Fortune 100 company about filling their talent gaps. And they have not since hired anybody out of our program, but they're talking about all the jobs that they need to fill and why they're a great place to work. And while they are, their wages are fairly competitive and their benefits package is very competitive. And the HR manager was talking about 401k, which is a great benefit for individuals. But she kind of alluded to the fact that was having no impact on their ability to attract talent, which reminded me of a story of another employer that we work with who doesn't have the same talent issues. And one of the big incentives that they put in front of people early on is not the 401k or the life insurance policy. It's a $50 a week gas card. And because when we're looking at individuals that are coming out of poverty and that have been in a poverty mindset, and they had that lens for a long time, they're in crisis mode. At best, they're looking out 48 hours. Most of the time, they're looking out 24 hours. And so everything is coming at them fast, and they're trying to survive. And so a $50 gas card in their hand, they can ensure that they can get back and forth to work and carpool with each other and make sure those in their immediate circle are successful. Now, that's not long-term. This company has the 401k plans once individuals are established, but they found that small, just different twist on the way to look at it has dramatically increased their retention, and it's dramatically increased how the community views them as an employer, as, hey, they get us. They understand what we're going through, and we want to work for that company.
So I'll leave it to the guys with business. So how is, either with Omega or CPM or even Hy-Vee, how do you guys overcome that transportation perceived or actual barrier that you get with potential employees or existing ones?
Yeah, so at my time with Omega, it was a significant issue. And what we would see is we would hire somebody and they would have a ride lined up for orientation. That would last for a couple days, but then we would start to see tardiness issues or attendance issues. And then at that point, they'd just give up because their ride fell through and they're like, well, forget it. Didn't work out. So we actually partnered with a local taxi agency, The Loop. I actually met the owner, Barb Saffold. If anybody knows Barb in here, you need to meet her. She's a great lady and larger than life. But I met her at a minority unemployment listening tour, and she was concerned about being able to find available work and find people that could actually utilize her service. And I said, and I'm just sitting there and I'm thinking about, okay, barrier transportation, taxi company, bingo, and started a partnership with her. And what we did is we basically set up a program where we gave people essentially a kind of like a bus pass or a taxi pass, and for the first 2 weeks of employment. And the thought being that then at the end of those 2 weeks they actually have a paycheck, and then they can actually afford fuel, or even better scenario, they can carpool, and they've made a relationship with somebody that can help get them to and from work. And so, and that was successful, I think, in two ways. A, it got people to work, which was what I think most employers want and are struggling with. And but the second impact that was totally unintentional was then the word got out, and then people were like, oh. So just like you said, it shows that you're making an investment in your employees as an employer. And that doesn't always seem to be the case, right?
So it showed you cared about
Absolutely.
it. Yeah, I just thought your bottom line.
Help build that culture.
What's Hy-Vee saying?
Along the same lines when it comes to fringe benefits. So one thing we've looked at, we've kind of gone case by case as we've studied this, and I'll just bring up the Des Moines market to talk about. Can I get that microphone? Sorry,
You just keep it down there.
I'm old, I'm tired, I'm getting sick. That better? Okay. So, the Des Moines market is really unique. You know, it's a spread out area. It's got a lot of different zones. You know, you got Waukee, you got out west, you got downtown, north, south, east, west, and downtown, and all that. And, you know, as I've been out recruiting, I may have a job in Urbandale and be interviewing someone who'd be perfect for it that's on the south side of Des Moines. The problem is they can't get up there. And, you know, the bus system is good. It's not superb, but it's good. And one thing we've come up with is, and it's in process, I actually have a bid sitting on my desk right now, that we would actually offer free bus fare for anyone who works for Hy-Vee at our stores, at our corporate office, and any of our subsidiaries in the Des Moines area. So it's a six-figure number, I'll tell you that. So it's not cheap, it's a good investment. But, you know, if you go back to the number of $6,000 for every time you turn over an employee, if I can start, you know, mitigating that, that'll help pay for it. We have a total of about 20,000 employees in the Des Moines area that'd be able to use it. And not only just to go to work, but they'd be able to use it to go to the mall. So you can be in the south side, but you want to go out to Jordan Creek Mall, right? You go to the mall there. Or you can go all the way to Ankeny or whatever it might be if you need to get somewhere. So it's kind of fringe benefit for that area. We're going to look to make it customizable because I also think about the Madison market up in Wisconsin, where unemployment is a little bit, actually I think it's a little bit lower than what we see here. And what we've realized, and the funny thing is they have a retail college, so I'm up there a lot talking to students. They want to come work for us, they can't get to us. They can't even get to us to shop. And so we know that they can't come to work. I mean, I have so many entry-level assistant manager jobs, or could take someone who's artistic who wants to be a cake decorator or a floral designer just to get them through school, but they can't get to us. So what we're going to look to do is do an Uber service where we can basically subsidize Uber rides for them to get to campus and being able to, get to our store locations just so they can have an opportunity to work. And then they'll drink the Kool-Aid and they'll stick around 20 years like me after that. So.
Go ahead.
We actually have another employer in our area that tried to solve this very creatively, and they have a board, a transportation board, that they put up in their facility where if you need a ride, you can post on there, and someone else who's a coworker can then, it's like a ride share, and they actually, once you pull that name, you can talk to HR and they'll actually subsidize it for you. And so it kind of works as a coordination piece between employees.
And that's something that we looked at too. There's rideshare programs where the transit company can actually purchase a van, let's say, and then you actually give this to 6 or 7, however many employees it holds, and then they're responsible for that van. And it can be used. It's usually very good from outlying areas into the urban area. That's one solution. We recently, with the Cedar Valley Alliance, did a survey on the industrial park out there, and we seen there was a need for transit. Unfortunately, with multiple routes operating all day, you have to have a ridership to justify it. It just wasn't there, but it's something that we're still looking at doing. There's also a federal program, and I'm not sure if you're aware of it, but it's the Employer Pass program, where the employers can purchase passes for their employees for transit, and it's a right. It's a used.
Depends out. Again, depends out.
Spell that one more time.
It's the Employee Pass program. But I think Principal in Des Moines is one that uses that probably the most, and I have along with the van share. But expanding service in our area, Airline Highway has been a priority for us out there because of the employment. That's why we did that survey. So we need the ridership to warrant this.
Yeah.
So next barrier we'll get into, and just based on, especially who we have up here. I remember the CAPS program I worked with Cedar Falls Schools, we did a project with Omega Cabinet when Kyle was there, that you guys were running in and seeing the data you looked at. That was a barrier to getting and keeping some employees was childcare.
Mhm. Yeah, so plug for the CAPS program, great program. I actually had two high school students help me out in kind of really starting to take a look at daycare in the context of it being a barrier to my employment. So what we were seeing, if we take a look at the numbers, the turnover, Omega Cabinetry, there's about 1,000 employee population there. We were hiring 400 people a year. So not sustainable, right? And I had a staff of 3 full-time HR
And
professionals.
those weren't new positions, you were trying to
Those
fill
are,
those positions.
yeah,
That's
there were a couple new positions there, but mostly just replacing. And so 3 HR professionals on my team, all they did was recruit all day long. You know, that's expensive in and of itself. So we quantified how much is this turnover costing us. It came up to about $4,000 a person. And then we took a look at our turnover numbers and see why are people leaving. And one of the surprising reasons that bubbled to the surface was daycare, and to a tune of about $20,000 a month. And so at that point, we're like, okay, we need to put some energy behind this because this is getting expensive. And if you think about it on a personal level, it makes sense because there would be people that wanted to enter the workforce, that wanted to earn money and sustain themselves, that had children, and maybe they had daycare with a family member, then that family member couldn't provide daycare any longer. And now what do? They have to quit, right? Or potentially they have a child in substandard care because they are desperate and looking for a job. And I don't want that to happen either. So actually partnered with Mary and her organization, the Iowa Child Care Resource and Referral Authority. And then I found out that there's a huge gap in daycare. It's not just me. And so I'll kind of turn it over to her to talk through that a little bit.
Yeah, so definitely we've seen a huge decline in availability slots for childcare, which we probably all are aware of. 41% has been our decrease in childcare slots in the last 5 years. So Child Care Research and Referral holds a lot of data on our website. You can go to our website and look per county what the decrease is. So when Kyle came to us, it was actually right after our agency, Exceptional Persons, had looked at opening a child care center. We did not receive funding. We needed $150,000. We did not receive the funding for it, so we kind of went back to square one. I had kind of partnered with some local legislators to say, okay, we need to talk about this because we should have been able to receive this money. And I was just advised, let's make this a community issue. So that's kind of how the Child Care Coalition started, because soon after that, Kyle came to our door and we started partnering. So we're really...
He's got 20 grand a month he's saving now,
Yeah.
so you've tapped into
Yeah,
that.
thank you. We're working on that.
Yeah.
Times that times 12. I mean, that's about childcare centers. So we're definitely, the main goal of the coalition is really to get the community awareness out there and to talk and just start talking. It's really how our partnership now with Hawkeye Community College started for the ALC centers. They knew we were looking, they were also looking at partnering, and it's just kind of that business model of two businesses coming together to meet the needs of their staff and their students. We're also looking at retaining folks in the child care field. So that's another piece of it. At Child Care Resource and Referral, we see, again, this decline. We see people leaving the field. They don't want to deal with the regulations. They're retiring after a long time. There's no benefits, there's no pay. Or there is pay, but the pay isn't high. So the one thing that we're looking at right now as the coalition is forming a child care insurance package. And we sent out a survey in last month, I believe it was.
As far as being self-employed, that type of insurance.
Yes, so health insurance, a small business package is kind of what we're looking at. We sent out a survey statewide to child care providers. 1,400 providers were surveyed. Within the first day, 420 responded to our survey, so we definitely know there's some interest. We're working with a local insurance company here in town, the Excel Group, to really look at that package and determine some rates that we can maybe in January send out to our child care providers, homes, centers, preschools, everyone to say, okay, here's the small business package. Someone like Grin and Grow, who's in the room, Melissa's here today, and that she could possibly look at that package for her staff, which is awesome. So we're really excited about what could come from that. But the main goal really is that community awareness and bringing people like Kyle to the table to say, okay, how can we help you with your childcare barriers?
On the childcare issue too, we looked at, it's about 4 or 5 years ago, of having a childcare center in our transportation center located in downtown Waterloo. Perfect fit, I think. Funding was an issue. At that time, the federal government actually did away with a program called JARF, which was Job Access Funding. It was to get people to work. It's a federal program that was working. Of course, they eliminated it, probably because it was working. But we think a natural place is a transfer center where folks can ride the bus down there, have the daycare right there. We haven't given up on that. We've given up on the location of where it's going to be, but we're working with the city of Waterloo and another parcel that could happen. But we think that's a natural fit.
Mayor Hart has quite an office that might be able to convert that.
He's listening.
Yeah, I'm on his list. So talk about that obstacle in Kalamazoo and overcoming those barriers when it comes to childcare.
Oh,
With the students you run into.
you know, I think about 75% of the people that come through our programming have children, and usually not one. I think the average number is 3 or 4, and childcare is always an issue. Access to childcare, quality childcare is an issue. But we don't step back, and I think, you know, as Kalamazoo, we have some great resources. There's one on the north side, there's one in the center of town. But we don't look at when childcare opens, when they have to start the job, what the bus schedule is, and how that, and a place that the parents would be comfortable sending their kids to. And so it's ongoing and it's a patchwork. Right now that I know Kalamazoo is focused on pretty heavily, but I think what it's going to be stuff, you know, bubbling up in the neighborhood. It's going to be more neighborhood type providers. Anytime they've tried to do a centralized location, it's not a good location for somebody. And when that happens, it makes it hard for the entire community to get behind it, because it's kind of like, well, that's great for you, you can walk your kids there, but I have to take a 20-minute bus ride to get there, and I won't be able to make it to work on time. Childcare leads to the, you know, job loss at an alarming rate. So, yeah, we have struggled to find permanent solutions, and most of the time it's getting family members and friends to watch kids is what we see a lot. But that leads to its own anxiety and affects worker performance in the term of, you know, we had an employer that we talked to, they're like, yeah, this guy that worked for us has been great the last 6 months, he's been fantastic. On time, performing very well. The last 2 weeks, like, we've written him up 3 times for being on his phone. I'm like, did you ever ask him why he's on his phone? If his pattern, his consistent behavior was he was a good performer and now he's on his phone, it's not his true colors are now shining through, it's something might have happened. And when they asked, it was, yeah, my childcare fell through, my kids are staying with my mother-in-law who has X issue and I don't really trust her, but I had to keep my job in order to keep my kids, and so I'm thrust into this situation. But we don't, I don't know, have we asked the community what that looks like? I know in Kalamazoo we struggle with that, asking the community what that looks like, and then designing around what their voices are saying as opposed to designing around something that fits within a current model that we have. And that's the shift that has to take place in this work is, you know, we can design the perfect system in our minds, but that's based on our worldview, how we access services, and we need to elevate those voices of the individuals that are going to engage in the service.
Well, one aspect of childcare has really increased here over the last 10 or 15 years, especially look at the cost of it. And whether that's an economics issue or supply and demand of you're having family members deciding to stay home because they can't afford that, and you've got some educated people that could be in the workforce. That's a whole other obstacle of trying to fill jobs, but they need to fill the job that we're missing because we don't have enough childcare providers.
We had on Battle Creek, which is a community near us, they had an industrial park similar to what you have here, and the businesses, like 5 of them got together and built a 24-hour daycare facility. They didn't get any state funding for it. They got, I'm sure, tax credits, which that's how we do things. And they had it. They made it available to all, and it was a benefit and because it was shared between 5 large companies, the cost was doable, and so they could ride the bus with their kids all the way there, You know, it was close enough that you probably could walk to check on your kids at lunch if you wanted to, and walk back, which has an effect on a lot of people in their work. And it was just an interesting solution that it was, oh, why don't we put the child care system next to where the parents work? And we have these industrial parks or these big areas where there's a lot of business. It's not undoable.
So there's a couple things that I think employers can do that we did, and part of that's just being more flexible with shifts. So in manufacturing, it's not typical to get part-time shift options, but we offered part-time shifts and we filled every single one in 2 weeks. And it was primarily working parents that their spouse was working the first shift job, and then they wanted to earn some extra money, but they were watching the kids on first shift, so they would come work from 4 to 8 o'clock at night, or 8 till midnight, or whatever shift worked for them. And we just made sure that work was variable work, that it was driven by volume, and it didn't really matter when it got done, as long as it got done. So we structured that, and that worked well. There was a little more management of schedules and that kind of thing, but it wasn't a big deal. So we did some of that. A couple case studies in Iowa. We had the opportunity to go down to Early Childhood Iowa Summit and hear about some really cool stories. So Vermeer down in Pella, Pella's a really remote area. They have, what do they call it, Yellow Academy, or I can't remember what they call it, but they have an on-site child care center. They're actually doing STEM curriculum, so they're taking it the next step further to help little children whose minds are developing start to think in the way that we want people to think in the workplace, which was pretty cool. And then Lee Container out of Centerville, Iowa, a school got shuttered, and they went and they turned the school into a daycare center for their employees. And they just did it. And the CEO said, we need to do this. This is an issue. They had workforce issues, and they just made a decision and made it happen. So it can be done.
Right.
So.
And they're charging their staff that have children there $1 an hour for childcare. And when he told us that, we were like, oh, whoa,
Where's this
wow.
at, fella?
Centerville. You gotta move to Centerville.
Yeah, how much money I can save?
Lake Rapids pretty.
Yeah, exactly. They've just recently opened probably within the last, yeah. But I asked him how many children. He said, we have 10 children as of now. We can take up to 40 children. But he goes, we'll continue to evaluate that need. And we know that we're probably going to lose money on this as far as providing this service, but he goes, it's keeping our staff there and our children. And so it's a very cool model.
We've got two or three of the barriers, but anybody have any thoughts or questions they'd like to ask anybody up here, or a comment? Beth?
Have you, I would be interested if anybody on the panel has addressed the child care cliff effect, and if that's come up, and how that's been addressed, where if you get a certain amount, you earn a certain amount, then you lose a disproportionate amount of your child care subsidy, so that disincentivizes people to move up or, take that senior bump or whatever.
Legislatively, there should be a sliding scale, not a cliff.
Well,
You get a 25-cent raise, and you lose complete funding for your child care.
I'm Deanne Cook. I direct the statewide United Way Association, and we have worked on that issue legislatively for almost 10 years. Iowa has one of the very lowest child care assistance rate programs in the country. We did address child care provider reimbursement rates a bit in the last legislative session, so that will help a little bit with our child care deserts, but we didn't help the families at all. And as he said, you just fall off. You don't stagger back down.
Child care deserts and child care cliffs. Those are terms I haven't heard yet. So,
It's definitely been a hot topic, the child care cliff. I think our coalition has talked about it, but we just continue to bring it up to our legislators here. We will see an increase in the child care assistance rate this next year in January, especially for those programs that participate in the quality rating system. So even if they're at a level 1, they'll see an increase, which we're calling that a small victory in the state, because that's just continuing to get that message out there. And I know at the federal level, it's just a conversation we keep having, and there's just not a magic answer yet.
One of the creative things that we did is, we know that the benefits cliff is a very real thing that a lot of individuals face. And so when we place somebody in employment, we support them for the first 90 days. We actually incentivize the first 90 days of employment. And we do this strategically, A, to maintain relationships with them, provide feedback, but also to help transition those cliffs that they fall off. So at 30, 60, 90 days, the employers get a questionnaire from us. It's pretty simple, you know, are they showing up on time, how are they learning at appropriate pace, overall attitude, and if they meet or exceed the employer's expectations, they get $250 from us. This is an opportunity to give them a little bit extra cash that help mitigate some of that cliff effect, but it's also an opportunity for the employer and us to have a conversation about the employee, you know, coaching the employer, what they're seeing, what they can do, what issues they're facing, and that's done, that's profoundly affected the 90-day retention. And what we found is if you can help an individual transition for that first 90 days, after that, the income's coming in at a certain rate, and the jobs that we're placing individuals in at, you know, $13 an hour and up, they're still going to qualify for some things, and so it's just getting over that initial hurdle. So that's what we did.
And the other thing is, you know, within that, so that's 250 at 30, 250 at 60, and 250 at 90, so it's not just all together. And then one of the things that we are capable of doing, because we don't have a lot of regulations behind our funding, is that we're able to customize for each individual. And so when we run across an individual who says, hey, my issue is childcare, if we can find somebody with childcare, I need help with that, well, we can help hook them up with that, and then we can redirect that money. And so rather than doing the 30, 60, 90 incentive, we do just pay for childcare for it until they start receiving, you know, consistent checks.
Anybody else say anything?
Comment and question.
Sure.
Childcare is an issue, but as our workforce gets older, they're also caring for their aging parents. So I feel like that's an issue that causes stress too. And just kind of curious if any companies have thought about the benefits of doing maybe 4 10-hour days instead of your regular 5 8-hour days, just to give the worker that extra day to either take mom to an appointment or maybe not have to send their kids to daycare.
I think that's a very good point. It's a very good question. You know, we talked a little bit about that earlier, about, you know, adjusting shifts and all that. I know one thing that we've done, and we've encouraged some of the stores, again, with our autonomous system of IV, every store runs like it's its own. But we've encouraged, you know, take care of your employees, whatever that may be. So I'm thinking back to an example. I had a cake decorator who had an ailing mom, exact same situation, and wanted to take care of her. And she was going to die. And she wanted to spend the last 6 months, I believe, taking care of her. So being a cake decorator, I didn't necessarily need her there during the day. I just needed her to do orders so she could work at night while she took care of her mom during the day. Or, you know, with 7 days a week and us being a 168-hour-a-week business, you know, there's 40 hours a week for her to do her job. The system managers, I think, you know, like our system manager position, where it kind of goes along the same deal, but, you know, it's a challenging shift. It's nights and weekends. So going to a 4-day-a-week gives someone a life, right? And that kind of goes to the same deal, being able to take care of a family member, or like I have a friend of mine who takes care of a sibling for the same type of deal, has to take care of it, so he needs 3 days off during the week, and then they have some other arrangements for the rest of the week, allowing that, you know, it's that life balance that you can take care of your priorities and responsibilities, still being able to keep a good job. When things change, we change back with them. So we encourage it a lot. It's still always up to the store because, you know, we got customers to take care of, but any way we can take care of an employee, and your best asset, good employee especially, we want to do that.
In addition to that, some of our school systems have gone to the rotating year-round model too, which actually helps in that situation as well. Even though I like having 3 months off, but you know, to where it's a shorter break, but they go throughout the entire year. And so if you have school-age children, then they're still going to school, and you don't have the 3 months where you have no assistance at all. So.
One barrier we didn't really get into in our last roundtable, we started talking about substance abuse. In my work in economic development, I would visit with companies, and you would get somebody that, you know, wouldn't hire because of a drug test or a failed drug test. And then it evolved into, well, what drug was it? You know, because they were needing workers, you know, and if it's pot, okay, then that's fine, we'll let them in. Talk about what you've seen through that, either the retail end or service end or construction end, and Kyle doesn't know which avenue, I think, to go down, just the expression.
Oh, yeah. So drug testing, I can tell you that a lot of local employers are bound by corporate oversight, and a lot of them say you have to drug test. In my last company, it was a pass-fail, and if you failed it, you failed it, and that's it. There was no discussion to be had, and I truly believe if you're going to drug test, then you can't say, well, you know, cocaine's okay, but crack's not. You know, I mean, it doesn't work, right? You can't have that type of policy. So, you know, I'm sharing a lot, but we don't necessarily drug test unless it's reasonable suspicion. As we're looking at individuals, it goes back to our theory at our company. The same thing goes for criminal background check, but we do screening based upon our criteria. We don't do screening based upon drug screens and background checks. And the idea is that if our screening is good enough, we don't have to worry about, we'll find out if they're under the influence of something as we screen. Or we'll find out if they're untrustworthy and they're to be feared through our screening mechanisms. So that might be a little outside of the ordinary for us, but we haven't in the last however many years we've been in existence. And I can tell you that we, at my last company, we would screen out about 20% of our people that had extended job offers through pre-employment drug screening. So it's definitely a challenge.
You know, it's a unique question I think about myself. We're all friends here, right? So I can say what I'm about to say. If we would have drug tested 20 years ago, I wouldn't be in this room right now. Right? It's just facts. We drug test now. And it's unfortunate because I can meet someone who's awesome and I want to hire you and they fail the drug test. We do allow them to retake it after 6 months, I'm sorry, maybe it's 3 months. So we do want to give them another crack, right? Hey, go.
No pun intended.
I've never done crack. I don't know much about crack. So, you know, and then I think back to also our current employees. The only time you'll get drug tested is if you are in an accident or you injure yourself or you cause damage of $1,000 or more. Like my pool car outside, if I get in an accident, I get tested, right? I'll be okay now, I promise. But, you know, there at that point, we'll give you an opportunity to maybe have a problem. If you maybe have a problem, we'll help you get treatment. We have programs set up that will help you get treatment, so hopefully you'll be better and you can maybe get off the substance abuse. So that's what we want to support, because yeah, we realize it's a big barrier, but it's also a barrier to keep your job. We've learned a lot, especially going into the restaurant industry, having restaurants. It's pretty, you know, it's a big thing with restaurants. And it's actually made it harder for us to hire. Because they know, hey, you got drug tests? Okay, no, I'm sorry, I won't come to you anyway. You know, so it's just that it's you know, we want to help. We understand that, you know, there's things out there that people do in their life that may or may not affect their work, but it's still important that they know that we can't have you working under the influence.
Do you have any high-vis in the states that have legalized marijuana?
I know Minnesota for medicinal use, I believe. So if they do present their card or whatever it is, I have not seen it. I'm still very naive when it comes to that nowadays in my life. It's just, I don't know much. I smelled it when I went to Vegas. You smell it everywhere. Smell marijuana. But, so as long as they bring the card, even though they test, we'll know, hey, if you do test for this, it'll still get sent into a lab that we'll normally do. And that's just pre-employment screening. You still can't come to work under the influence.
This is actually a huge issue for us in Michigan, having just passed, you know, not just medical marijuana, but recreational marijuana, which hasn't actually been enacted yet, but you wouldn't know that. If you took it as a shot. It's legal. So, you know, it's something that we've had to have lots of discussions with both our legal team as well as our employers. And it's not going to change anything for the employers who have to test because of insurance purposes. And so that's not going to change. But it is going to change significantly because it's already been a barrier. If you talk to a lot of our employers, they'll tell you, well, if I could just get somebody to pass a drug test, I could have, all of my positions full. And so it's going to get worse from that standpoint. And so how do we deal with that? How do we support that? I think it was a fantastic comment that you made about being able to support someone who admits. Not everybody has that stance, and that's something that as an HR team you should have, is you should have a plan for somebody who confesses, that, hey, I'm struggling with this. Have a plan to where you can re-engage them, because most people are fearful that when they are struggling, they can't seek help because they'll just lose their job anyway. So they just spiral.
I would say probably 90+% of the cases of substance abuse that we see and witness, the substance abuse is sought as an alleviation for pain or trauma. So the lens that we look at it through needs to change. I grew up, my dad was an emergency room doc, so we heard all the stories about, the drug tests, the drug seekers, and all that different thing. And so I had a certain lens of there was people that were making lots of choices and lots of bad choices that ended up with these issues. And then we met somebody that went through our program. I'll never forget this. She was a recovered meth user. And, she had, couldn't tell you how many felonies she had. She'd lost 3 of her kids to the state, never seen them again, was on the verge of losing more. And she's just like, this addiction's just been the bane of my existence. I said, well, when did you start using? What was that? What was that trigger? What was that piece? And she said, well, my mom used, and when I was 9, she gave it to me. And that completely altered how I viewed every single person that came in, because you never know what that cause was. And so we look at, right now the opioids are the big point of conversation, and we have all this, like, man, we need to address this. But the other drugs, it needs to be just the same. It's often a product of the environment and the pain that they have lived through that has affected them and that has driven to that. We have alcohol kills more people than a lot of those drugs combined, but we don't look at it through the same lens. We don't fire somebody because they come in hungover. We might send them home, but we don't fire them. And so I think while I disagree, and I'm not really a fan of the legalization of marijuana, I do think it's causing us to have different conversations around the issues. Recently, the state of Michigan probation has stopped screening for marijuana completely. They just don't. Unless you come in noticeably high to your probation meeting, they're not going to screen, because they were realizing that it's an attempt to remove pain in somebody's life, and that it was better to continue the conversation and continue the relationship than it was to just lock it back up. That's not going to do anything. And so this, we had somebody last year that graduated, worked for 7 months, and things were going well, and then some stuff happened at home, and he started drinking again. He'd been sober for a couple years. And the employer recognized that, reached out, put him on FMLA, sent him to rehab for 3 months, brought him back, and he's stayed engaged. They protected their investment, all because they saw the human aspect of that addiction. And most people that are trapped in some form of that don't really want to be. They don't, but they often haven't been shown that grace and that acceptance of where they're at in their life at that moment, and been shown a way out that I'm going to love you and I'm going to walk alongside you to get out. So it's a complicated issue, and it's going to get more complicated. We do not have a standardized test to determine whether or not somebody's under the influence of marijuana. We can test if it's in their system. We can't test if they're high, and that's a problem. Cocaine stays in your system for 48 hours, 3 days. Meth stays in your system for 24 hours. Not much. So you could have somebody that smokes Friday night, they're clean Monday morning, they're in violation of your drug policies, and we don't know what to do. And I would also, I know in Kalamazoo, If we went and drug tested everybody at every law firm, everybody that worked at every hospital, all the senior management at businesses, you would lose a lot of people. And so at certain levels, we're okay with it, and we think it's funny. At the upper levels, oh, this is something, the 60s, I like weed, it's how I relax, I'm gonna eat my gummy bears. But then if you're at that base level employee, though, we have a different lens. And I think we need to have an understanding that this isn't just a frontline employee issue, this isn't just people that don't have jobs issue, this is an epidemic throughout all our communities, and we need to look at it as a crisis as opposed to something that we can, put in a box and say, skirt.
It's just a coincidence I got Cheetos in my pocket. So in our last session, going off of what Luke was speaking in, and we'll target Kyle because he got targeted this in our last session.
Keep going.
Biases, and we all have them. And to do this kind of work, to make this kind of change in everybody that's up here or out there, if you, I can't remember if you said this, Kyle, or if she said it, but if you have a bias, or if you know of a bias, it means you've had that bias at some point. And to relate and change the way you think about hiring or promoting or evolving, you got to change yourself. And talk about going off the way last time we related to biases and perceptions.
Sure. So I think, it was a great question that Sharina Salas asked me, and she likes to pick on me, so that's all right. But I think that the word that was used in the last session, and I think it's appropriate, is privilege. And if you take one look at me, you realize that I look like a lot of other people in Iowa. I happen to have a Y chromosome, so that makes me lucky, I guess. And, I've never really had to deal with prejudice in my own life, outside of I'm a millennial, so, maybe a little bit. That pales in comparison to somebody that's in a minority population, and so I don't even like to use that analogy. But when I started doing some of this work, it was driven by the numbers, and it was simply that we have really low unemployment. I need people for my company. Unemployment numbers are higher in these communities: African American, disabled, poverty, and then there's population growth in some other areas, Asian American population growth in the Cedar Valley. And so it was just an effort to try to figure out, okay, how can I expand talent pools? And as I started to do that, I realized that I had some prejudices of my own that I had to work through. And some of them were just because I'm relatively sheltered in my upbringing. I've lived in Iowa my whole life. I haven't been exposed to a lot of different cultures until I started to reach out. And that's something about myself. But the other thing I would say that we didn't touch on enough in the last session was there are also some institutional barriers, and a lot of that has to do with the structures that we create to assess, screen, hire, terminate, and deal with our talent. And and we have all these fancy words like talent systems and developmental structures, but at the end of the day, if you have an application that asks questions in a certain way, you might be asking those questions and building up prejudice in your own mind. So, I think one of the examples is ban the box. And so initially, 5 years ago, before I started down this journey, I was adamantly against ban the box. Because I was like, how am I supposed to screen? That's going to be a lot of work for me and my team, and I've got to hire 400 people. How am I going to hire 400 people if they can't pass background checks? But as I learned more about it, in your brain, if that box is checked, you will treat that person differently. You'll have a different perspective on how you ask a question. Those questions that they respond with will be different in your mind, and that will matter. And it's the same for every type of prejudice that we all have, because we all have them. And we've got to be comfortable and courageous enough to say, this is a problem for me, I need to understand it, and I need to be culturally sensitive to it and change my
it reminded me of an email pulling up now. I think about names, right? When you hear the name say Lieutenant Lowe, you don't have a neighbor. Chances are you have a neighbor with that name. Pretty unique. You know, U.S. orchestras, you know, as we go out and we talk to our stores, because really, for me, it's about, I need to influence 250 store directors, CEOs, to think about their biases and think about the prejudices and things that are creating barriers for employment right now, right? I have their ear right now because they can't find people. So I have their ear. And I got to talk about the language of the C-suite. Language of the C-suite is money. How are they going to improve the bottom line? How are they going to feed themselves? How are they going to feed their families? So you need employees to do that. So I have their ear. I got them listening, and then I just point out some of the little things that we do. And so bring up the example of U.S. orchestras. Traditionally, in the 60s and 70s, they were male only, right? Male, open auditions, people would see them. Well, they went to just changing the name and also blind auditions. They even went to the extent, and it's kind of, you know, it's a little bit of, you know, bandbox where, you know, not really knowing who's coming in the room, just someone with an instrument, right? Even went to the extent and put carpet down so you couldn't tell if there's heels click-clacking across the floor. Totally changed the imperative, totally changed the narrative of what you'd see the makeup of orchestras be. So I think about names, right? Names are unique to me. I enjoy names. My best friends in college, we call ourselves Team Minority. We're all first generation. So one of my best friends is a cousin named Isa Karache, applied for IT. And one of my good friends in IT said, hey, when he applies, let me know. So I let him know. Looks at his name. The team reviewed the application on October 24th and did not choose to move forward with an interview. I'm like, okay, why? Give me a reason, because I need to go back and tell him. And I said it not so nice, because I'm not really nice when I don't need to be. I have to be an agitator at times too. Is there an explanation? I asked him. And then I called him, and he didn't call me back, so I left him a voicemail. And then he said, we're in the process of reviewing 178 candidates. Reason, he said, failed screening. Is he a U.S. citizen? Well, yes, he actually was born and raised in Bettendorf, Iowa, and he went to Simpson, right? And he's applying for an apprenticeship when he's got a degree in IT and computer science. So I want you to think about that. So I asked him to revisit it. But, you know, it goes back to the same thing. If you hear a name, what's the first thing you look at? What's the first thing you think about? Right? And then we try to categorize and figure out where they're going to fit. So, more than just optically, how are they even getting through the application process? You know, they say European, if you have a European sounding name, 1 in 10 applications will get you a call back for an interview. If you have a more of a unique sounding name, it could be Middle Eastern, it could be Mohammed. It's my real first name, if you didn't know that. It's Mohammed. Or, you know, Perez, or you know, whatever it could be, it's 1 in 15. And why is it? It doesn't mean that the credentials aren't there, it's just that you can't get past the name. And we all do it. One last quick example, I'm gonna give this mic up because I'm talking too long. And this is something I did. Young African-American male with dreadlocks who's at our Hy-Vee career day comes and walks up to me. And I look at him, how you doing? And the store director introduces me, store director's a good friend, introduces me to him. So I'm thinking in my mind, okay, maybe he's in the management training program, right? Because St. Louis challenged everyone to focus on diversity and find management and leadership and make sure that we're inclusive in all levels of the company. So what do you do? So you're an assistant manager? My first question to him. No, I'm a cake decorator. I'm like, I paused and I was like, oh, cool, right? Because I've already pictured him as he walks in the building as not a cake decorator. Very artistic, right? Because there's a lot of people who look at that just like a nurse and say, oh, that's a woman's job. Let's be real. So that's what we're up against. But back to some of the points I heard, we got to identify our own biases and also just do our best not to bring them to the workplace. I just talk about slowing down and thinking through, but also look reality in the eye and deny it.
I've asked Mary to go along in your line of work, the organizations you're a part of, and the groups you come in contact with, and who you come in contact with. There's that when it comes to childcare too, is there's biases of how the kids will be or who they are or what.
Right, yeah, definitely. I think we see that a lot at Child Care Resource Referral. I'm looking over at my staff, but we hear a lot of, and this, I'm going to talk about behaviors and children's behaviors, and parents having a hard time finding that right fit for the child too. So we see a lot of that, of trying to find that right fit, but also what are the resources that will help those children succeed, and who's willing to take that next step as well to get them to that.
We
Luke,
have
you
a
had,
problem where you don't, parents won't you add a male working in childcare
Yes,
center.
absolutely. Yep.
Infant room, it's like,
Like they've got to be a pedophile or have something wrong with them.
I remember I had a guy one time, I was at a bar, sorry, same thing, when we were younger. And I'm a director, and I don't work with the kids, I was HR for a long time, and he said, what are you, queer, or you pedophile or something? And I was like, oh, what? And this guy was a special education teacher in the Waterloo school system. I said, you're a teacher, but you should ask me the same thing, so it is kind of
Yeah,
strange a little bit.
it is, yeah.
Especially the kids love males. in-
Yeah.
in this childcare
We
center.
had an infant lead when I was at Valley Park, actually, when I was the director there, and he actually closed the room at night. And at first, we could see our infant parents kind of being like, who's this? He was a bigger guy, he was very friendly, but kind of stepping back to say, okay, this was 15 years ago. But by the end of it, they loved him because he was so personable. He loved those babies so much, so it was kind of cool to see them, how they adapted and grew to love him as that infant teacher.
so I was gonna ask Luke in our last session, on that same topic, when you come in as a white male to lead the organization that's helping to overcome these conversations and things that were said of you or said about you or whatever, talk through that, but you were able to accomplish some things that somebody with that color barrier couldn't, just because of the situation it was.
Yeah, what I was saying before is we have to acknowledge who created systems in this country. If you look at systems in this country, from education to governmental systems to even faith-based systems, probably close to 100% of those systems were created by white men. And those systems caused a lot of good, and they caused a lot of harm. And so we have to understand it as a white male leading an urban organization. I had to understand that there's a certain piece of this that I have to understand the role of people that looked like me played in all of this work, and understand that I have a responsibility to speak out. The story that Nate's referring to is 5 months into my job as interim executive director. I wasn't even full executive director yet. A prominent African-American leader in Kalamazoo and I were having coffee. And he is one of those guys that could walk into any room and he would know 95% of the people. He had led nonprofits, he had worked for community colleges, he was running the economic development. He was vice president of Southwest Michigan First at the time. And he looked at me and he said, Luke, there's conversations that you can have in this town that I'm not allowed to have because of the color of your skin. Nobody knows who I am at this point. We've had no success or very little success. And so understanding that those that have privilege also have a responsibility to speak out, to address these systems. And it's not saying that you have privilege does not mean that you haven't worked hard. It doesn't mean that you haven't put in time. It means that there's systems out there that are literally designed to benefit you. Whereas there's other systems around that are designed to exclude other portions of the population. And that's some of the HR systems, some of the talent systems that we've designed have been from this perspective of I can walk into just about any room in most places in this country and I can see a lot of people that I know I have stuff in common with. Deborah, you were saying that you walk into a lot of rooms and you're looking around the room saying, okay, what can I say here? Who's going to agree with this? Who's going to agree with that? You're positioning. And so it's a different perspective that we have to understand. And as white male leads, I think we have a responsibility and an opportunity to walk in and have these conversations about racial bias, to have these conversations about gender bias, about role bias. It's the systems that we created that we're having to fight against, and it's our job to help shift those systems. In Kalamazoo, if you're a white male with a criminal background, you have like 2 or 3 times better chance at getting a job than an African-American male without a criminal background. That tells you how much bias there is within the system. That's not individual. That's not, you could have somebody that's completely trying to run a equitable system. But the system itself has a bias built into it, and that's what we have to start speaking out against. That's what you're speaking to with the name, where we can easily just, if you hadn't asked that question, why wasn't it considered, that system would have just kicked him right out. And so, yeah, did you have a question?
Yeah,
Yeah, go ahead.
first of all, I want to know, Nate, where's your socks at?
Caps Network, I'll get you some quick.
As long as they're not more than $2.99. So my question is, you know, so on the micro level, with hiring committees, you know, there's a perception sometimes that if you are of a different race, that you literally have to walk on water to have a successful interview versus someone else that may not have to. And you mentioned the 2/3, you mentioned other disparities, but do you have trainings for hiring committees that make sure that they evaluate people on the correct areas and not show any type of implicit biasness and vice versa throughout that process?
I want to hear what you have to say.
You know, not so much training, but we make sure, part of we've just formed, I'll say just formed, it's been a solid year, a D&I steering committee. And one of those things on there is it's been on hiring and hiring practices. And so with any hiring committee or vetting committee that we may have throughout the whole company, they cannot be homogeneous. Okay? They have to be mixed up with, it could be gender-based, it could be, if they, they disclose their orientation, whatever it could be to help kind of minimize that, to make sure that we are focused on hiring the right candidate versus someone who might fit the circle, right? Or, kind of what you're saying there. So we
Expound on that too.
fit in the circle, right? So someone who thinks like me, who acts like what I do, maybe we can talk about, we can go have a beer after work. Quentin, you and I have had beers after work, so you're my circle, right? So, but water cooler talk, they're my clique, right? Which is good sometimes, it builds camaraderie, it makes work fun, but it can be dangerous because it can exclude people, right? And we focus on inclusion, we want everyone to bring themselves to work. If I'm not part of the circle, I'm not gonna talk, I'm not gonna be heard, and I'm not gonna like my job. So being able to, kind of change that. I told a story one of the last times I spoke about, if you walk in my office right now, you'll see Hawkeye garb everywhere. And if you're a Cyclone fan, you might feel like you're marginalized from the start. I don't know. Probably should be. Not last week, though. Here we go. So, those are the things as we talk about your circle. Who's in your circle? Who's in your group? Are you taking the time to get to know people who aren't like you, maybe have, I'd say, improve your cultural competency and your social competency and get to learn about people? Or is it just people who look like you can go golfing with at the country club or go bowling with or go shoot hoops with or whatever it is?
One of the things that we've done is, as we've shifted our employer network to a paid network, we've also started adding some additional trainings. And so we do cultural competency trainings for HR, and we've actually started doing that also for our frontline supervisors within the companies as well. So we are allowing them to come back and get different training, exposure to biases, exposure to how do I overcome those, in my personal life, and start walking down that road of self-discovery is one of the things that we do. So.
Another piece is firsthand and proximity to people that are different than you. I think is huge. I know for me and my journey of understanding this issue, it's been getting close to the issue and the individuals that it affects. One of our favorite exercises that we did very early on was we do mock interviews multiple different times, so people come and get to practice interviews. And we had a lot of employers early on that said, we're not going to hire people with, let's say, a criminal background. We'll use that as an example. We can't. We're like, okay, you don't have to. You don't have to hire somebody with a criminal background. Just come and participate. We need volunteers to help do mock interviews. And it's great practice for them to know that it's a real employer that's helping them practice. And when we got done, we'd ask them, who had the criminal background? And they never got it right. Never once did they get it right. And in fact, oftentimes it was the individual that had the most extensive criminal background that they liked the most. And so having those micro instances where they can see that bias that they had against, all people with criminal backgrounds, and yet they pick out of, when they have a choice to choose and they don't have that information, they're picking based on talent. And you can build on that. Those HR managers are never going to forget that experience. They're never going to be able to say, like, whoa, I had that chance, and my bias was illuminated, so to speak. And so you can do different pieces like that where you've been intentionally challenging those and engineering those scenarios.
Time for one last question or comment. Anybody?
Can I just add, we did the Minority Unemployment and Outreach Standing Committee as part of the work of the State Workforce Board, and so this is an issue we've been talking about. And one of the things I think that we have heard from employers as part of that work is, please come in and train us. Please don't assume that we're racist, sexist, whatever, fill in the blank. That we have good intentions, but maybe we're not as self-aware as we need to be, or maybe our good intentions to be diversified are not translating to our hiring staff, our frontline HR folks, and so we need some help. So I think there's opportunity to really reach out to businesses and say, we will help you become more aware, we'll give you some, help you figure out how to be more diversified and how to recruit from a more diversified applicant pool.
I was going to say that I think, it's one thing to do, and trainings, we do trainings, and that's a real important piece, and trainings are important. It's something that if you have never been to a bias or diversity training, you should definitely do that. But I think in addition to that, you can't ever de-emphasize the one-on-one, right? And so when you come up against bias and you see it, we've all seen it, to be able to address it. And not to address it from a shame, I'm going to shame you, I'm going to damage you, but from, hey, why did you do that? What was the thought behind that? And sometimes just that itself is what leads to real change in our lives, and in our community.
Well, I can speak to that. We had an employer that now, I will say, is one of our better employers. In fact, they're the employer that does the $50 gas cards. And early on, I think 2 years ago, I know the CEO, he's like, love your program, love what you do, we want to start hiring people. And we were trying to put the brakes on them a little bit, like it's not just as easy as just hiring somebody that has backgrounds or has barriers and putting them in your organization. There's work to do. He's like, no, we have great HR teams, we've sent them to this, we've sent them to that. And so we placed 3 people with them. All 3 quit and took jobs other places within 3 months. And they've been successful. They've continued to work. But what that opportunity was, what he saw is that while he thought his organization was at a certain level, it wasn't. And we were able to go back and have conversations with him, have conversations with the senior HR, have conversations with the frontline. And over the course of the year, they went through a journey where they understood the role and the bias that their organization had. Because, his go-to was, hey, this person's coming out of these serious issues and we're going to treat them differently. How do you think that felt? You walk on the floor and the HR manager's talking to you more and checking in, and your coworkers are saying, why are you getting this special treatment? What's going on? That doesn't feel good. And so that instance was able, because we came and approached it with grace, like, hey, this highlighted some work that you have to do, and they engaged in that work. Now we place people and they stick and they stay long-term with this employer because they've done that foundational work that was necessary.
So as you wrap up here, some messages to look at. You look at how can you work on the bias that you have towards the people you're looking to hire or keep, but also think about how they need to overcome the bias they maybe have of themselves and the work they can do. But this takes time. Obviously, you can hear what Luke and Brian have said, and I got comments after their session of, all right, let's get going, let's do this, let's get going on it. It takes time, and it takes a different mentality, and I think the biggest thing we learn from it is saying, it's not about you getting the credit for it, it's about serving the people that need that work the most. So thank you, everybody, for being on the panel. Thank you all for being here.